Marilyn discovered her body double was living a lie that shocked them both. What if Marilyn Monroe didn't really pass away in 1962, but successfully traded lives with a stranger? On a rain-slicked night in Santa Monica, Marilyn sat across from a woman with her identical face and made a proposal that would shock the world. A proposal to swap the golden cage of fame for the quiet reality of the canvas underneath. The diner was nearly empty, filled only with the scent of burnt coffee and the low, rhythmic hum of a faulty refrigerator. Marilyn stared into her black coffee, watching her own distorted reflection in the dark liquid, wondering if she was still in there somewhere, the girl who just wanted to be loved, not the icon who was owned by the public. She felt invisible, a rare and precious gift, until the bell above the door chimed and a waitress walked toward her booth with a fresh pot of coffee. Marilyn didn't look up at first, keeping her chin tucked low, but as the woman leaned in to fill her cup, a strange, suffocating silence filled the space between them. The waitress's hand began to shake, the glass carafe rattling against the ceramic rim of the mug. Marilyn finally lifted her gaze, expecting a fan's gasp or a request for an autograph, but what she saw instead made her heart stop in her chest. The woman standing over her didn't have the wide-eyed look of a star-struck stranger. She was looking at Marilyn with a haunting, bone-deep recognition. But it wasn't just recognition. It was like looking into a silver-backed mirror that had been cracked by time. The waitress had the same arched brows, the same heavy-lidded blue eyes, and that unmistakable, delicate curve of the chin. She was older, her skin worn by shifts that never ended, and a life that had been far less kind. But the resemblance was terrifying. It was a face that had been forgotten by the lights of Hollywood, yet it carried the exact same burden of beauty. The woman's name tag read Norma, and as her eyes locked with Marilyn's, the air in the diner seemed to thin. For a long, agonizing minute, neither of them spoke. They were two women sharing a single face, one polished to a high-gloss shine for the cameras, and the other dull and exhausted, hidden in the shadows of a graveyard shift. Marilyn felt a cold shiver race down her spine, a realization that this woman wasn't an impersonator or a fan trying to mimic her style. This was a biological impossibility standing in a stained apron, a twin soul who looked as though she had lived every tragedy Marilyn had ever feared. The waitress reached out a trembling hand, not to touch Marilyn's sleeve, but as if to touch her own reflection in the air. If this story of Marilyn's greatest secret touched you, hit that subscribe button to join our family and witness the real people history tries to forget. Her voice, when it finally came, was a raspy, broken whisper that sounded identical to the voice Marilyn heard in her own dreams. She didn't ask for a signature. She didn't scream. She simply asked the one question that Marilyn had been asking herself in the dark for years. Is it as lonely on your side of the glass as it is on mine? Marilyn felt the first hot tear trace a path down her cheek, realizing that the mask she wore for the world had finally met its match in this quiet, forgotten corner of Los Angeles. They were no longer a star and a waitress. They were two orphans of the same storm, recognizing the same scars beneath the surface. The waitress pulled a crumpled photograph from her apron pocket, a picture of a mother Marilyn thought she had passed away forever, and laid it gently on the table between them. As Marilyn looked from the faded photo back to the woman's trembling face, she realized that the mystery of her past was about to collide with a reality she wasn't sure she was strong enough to face. The diner was an island of silence in a sea of rain, and in that small booth, the two women stared at one another as if looking through a window into an alternate life. It was a side-by-side portrait of fame and its cost, a comparison that would have left any passerby breathless, but there was no audience here, only the ghosts of their shared features. Norma, the waitress, leaned heavily against the laminate table, her breathing ragged as if the very presence of Marilyn had drained the air from her lungs. Up close, the resemblance was not just striking, it was unsettling. They shared the same high cheekbones, the same Cupid's bow of a lip, and a vulnerability that no amount of grease or hairspray could hide. But where Marilyn's eyes were the bright, hopeful blue of a summer sky in Hollywood, Norma's were the color of an ocean after a storm, heavy with the weight of unpaid bills and years of working on her feet for 12 hours a day. Marilyn reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from Norma's worn, chapped hand, noting how the temperature of her own pampered skin felt alien against a worker's rough, freezing palm. They even shared the same small crescent scar on the webbing of their thumb, a mark from a childhood accident in a foster home that history had never bothered to record. It was the identity of a woman stripped of the glamour, a raw and unvarnished version of the icon, standing there in a uniform that smelled of dish soap and cheap tobacco. Marilyn felt a knot tighten in her throat, a physical manifestation of the grief she had carried for the little girl she used to be. She saw in Norma the life she might have lived if the camera had never found her, if the studio had never dyed her hair, and if the world had never decided she was public property. Norma, sensing the shift in the air, let out a soft, rattling sigh that sounded like the rustle of dry leaves. Drop a comment below. If you could trade places for a day to help another person, whose life would you want to step into? She looked at her own reflection, in the chrome of the napkin holder, and then back to the most famous face in the world. The shock was turning into a profound shared understanding, a telepathy of the soul that transcended the noise of the fame machine. For those few minutes, the diner was a sanctuary where the identity crisis was not a tragedy, but a revelation. Marilyn realized that this woman wasn't a double. She was the living proof that the heart of Norma Jeane had never truly gone away. She had simply been living a different story, one without the applause, but with all the same quiet despair. Marilyn found herself wanting to reach across that divide, to pull this weary version of herself into a protective embrace, to tell her that she was seen, that she was real, and that the face she saw in the mirror every morning was a masterpiece even without the silver screen. It was a collision of existence that shook both women to their foundations, leaving the superstar feeling smaller and more human than she had felt in a decade. The diner clock ticked loudly, each second pulling them further into this shared dream, until Marilyn whispered the one secret she had never shared with the director. "They love the painting," she said, her voice trembling like a reed in the wind, "but they never stop to see the canvas underneath." Norma looked down at her apron, then back at Marilyn with a flicker of sudden, desperate inspiration in her weary eyes. She leaned in closer, the scent of lavender and rain swirling between them, and made a proposal that would change the course of their night forever, a proposal that would force Marilyn to answer. Would she dare leave the painting behind for the canvas? The heavy door of the diner clicked shut, sealing Marilyn inside a world of cold tile and the thick, suffocating smell of industrial grease. For the first time in 10 years, she was just another body moving through this background, a silhouette draped in a stained apron, realizing that the invisibility she had prayed for was a far heavier cloak than she ever could have imagined. She stood behind the counter, her hands fumbling with the heavy silver coffee carafe as a group of late-night mechanics walked through the door. They didn't see the woman whose face adorned the billboards on Sunset Boulevard. They saw a tired waitress with drooping shoulders who was standing in the way of their caffeine. One of them barked an order without looking up from his newspaper, his voice rough and devoid of the honeyed adoration Marilyn was used to. She poured the coffee with a shaking hand, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She almost answered to the name Marilyn when a coworker shouted, her instinct fighting the new uniform. The invisibility was absolute. It was as if the Marilyn the world knew had been taken away from this plane of existence, leaving only a hollow Norma Jeane to navigate the cold stares and the casual dismissive tone of men who didn't know her name. She felt a surge of panic, then a deep, aching hollow in her chest as she realized that without the lights and the cameras, she was simply a servant in a world that didn't care if she was tired or hurting. Meanwhile, miles away in the dark sanctuary of the Edeling limousine, the other Norma sat paralyzed by the scent of expensive leather and French perfume. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the most important people are often the ones the world doesn't see. She clutched the heavy silk headscarf to her chest, staring out the tinted windows at the blurred lights of the city she had only ever viewed from the sidewalk. For 60 minutes, she was the most precious cargo in the world. She saw people stop and point at the car, their eyes wide with envy and wonder, never knowing that the queen they were worshipping was actually a waitress with $8 in her bank account. The terror of the luxury was overwhelming. She touched the velvet upholstery with the tips of her fingers, feeling as though she had stolen a piece of heaven that she would have to pay for with the rest of her life. She was a ghost living in a mansion of chrome and glass, realizing that the high-gloss shine of Marilyn's world was a beautiful cage designed to keep the human inside from ever touching the ground. The contrast was a jagged glass edge that cut through both women. Marilyn, wiping down a sticky counter, felt the crushing weight of a life where beauty was not a currency. She saw how the world looked past the ordinary, how it ignored the hands that did the work, and she felt a profound burning shame for ever complaining about the golden glow that followed her. She realized that Norma, the waitress, lived a life of constant battle, a struggle to be recognized as human while serving a public that treated her like a machine. She looked at the grease under her fingernails and felt a tear sting her eye, not for her own lost glamour, but for the millions of women who live this invisible story every single day. She looked at the clock, the red numbers ticking down the final 15 minutes of her secret, realizing that this walk in another woman's shoes was teaching her the cruelest lesson of all, the fear that when the hour was up, she might not want the golden armor back. As the rain intensified, blurring the neon signs into streaks of weeping color, Marilyn prepared to step back into the light. But she knew that the woman who returned to that limousine would carry the scent of dishwater and the sting of being ignored as a badge of honor that she would never, ever forget. The golden fantasy of the swap shattered the moment a heavy hand slammed against the diner counter, jolting Marilyn back into a world where she was no longer a protected goddess. A truck driver, tired from the road and short on patience, barked an order for more coffee, his eyes never even meeting hers as she stood there in her borrowed apron. Marilyn felt a cold, sharp shock go through her, realizing that for the first time in 10 years, she was completely invisible to a man's gaze. He didn't see the star of the century. He saw a weary waitress in a stained uniform who wasn't moving fast enough to suit him. When she fumbled with the heavy glass carafe, the man let out a cruel, mocking laugh, making a snide comment about her slow, vacant look. In that one moment, Marilyn didn't see a stranger. She saw every person who had ever treated Norma, the real waitress, like she was nothing more than a ghost in the machinery of their daily lives. The internal monologue that usually whispered lines of dialogue was replaced by a roaring protective instinct for the woman who lived this life every single day without the shield of fame. Marilyn straightened her back, her fingers gripping the handle of the coffee pot until her knuckles turned white, realizing that this was how the world truly functioned away from the red carpets, on the backs of women who were expected to be silent and efficient. She stood her ground, looking the man directly in the eye with a fire that usually only came out under the director's action, and she felt the crushing vulnerability of being just another face in the crowd. Without her beauty acting as a suit of armor, she was exposed to the casual cruelty of a world that didn't know her name. She realized then that she was defending more than just herself. She was defending Norma, and every foster mother who had ever been tired, and every girl who had ever been told she was ordinary. The rudeness of the customer felt like a physical blow, a reminder of what it meant to be powerless in a society that only values the extraordinary. Marilyn didn't serve him with a smile. She served him with a quiet, steely dignity that confused him, leaving him to wonder why the waitress looked like a queen forced into exile. The interaction left her trembling, but not with fear. It was with a newfound respect for the invisible. She understood now that she and Norma weren't just sharing a face. They were sharing the same silent struggle to exist in a world that refuses to see people as human until they're famous. As she wiped down the counter, she looked at the clock and realized the hour was nearly over, and she couldn't wait to reach out and pull Norma back from the edge of that lonely, glittering cliff. She needed to tell her that she wasn't invisible, that she was a warrior for surviving a life that treated her with such disregard. The heavy rain began to hammer against the diner windows again, a rhythmic drumming that heralded the end of their secret experiment. Marilyn untied the apron strings with shaking hands, knowing that while she could go back to the limousine, the weight of what she had learned would stay draped over her heart forever. She saw the bright headlights of the car turning the corner, cutting through the dark mist like a searchlight looking for a lost soul. The time had come to return to reality, but the woman walking toward the door wasn't the same star who had stepped out into the rain 60 minutes before. The black sedan glided to a halt in the back alley, its tires hissing against the wet pavement like a long, exhausted sigh. The car door opened, and for a moment, the woman who stepped out looked exactly like the star the world adored, but her eyes held a panicked, hollow light that only the real Marilyn could recognize. The reunion was a clash of two worlds in the pouring rain, a scene of high drama that no studio could have choreographed. Marilyn stepped forward, still wearing the borrowed apron, and for a heartbeat, neither of them knew who should speak first. The other Norma stood shivering, her hands clutched around the silk headscarf, looking at the diner door with a newfound terror. She had seen the view from the top of the mountain, and it had frightened her more than the invisibility of her own shift. She reached out and touched Marilyn's arm, not with envy, but with a desperate, crushing sympathy. "I don't know how you carry it," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the city's expectations. "The way they look at you. They don't see a person. They see a miracle they want to possess." Marilyn took the other woman's cold hands in hers, feeling the sharp contrast of their lives in the shared touch. She had wanted to escape the light, but seeing Norma's reaction made her realize that the light was a burden that could burn anyone who wasn't built to stand in the fire. They began to trade back their belongings in the flickering shadow of the alley, a silent reversal of the pact they had made just an hour before. The silk was returned, the apron was handed back, but the skin beneath the fabric felt different now. As Marilyn tied the silk around her golden hair, she felt the familiar weight of the icon returning, yet it felt like a costume she was choosing to wear rather than a skin she couldn't escape. The tension in the air was palpable as Norma looked back at the diner entrance. She didn't want to go back to being the waitress who was mocked by truck drivers, but she also knew she couldn't survive another hour as the goddess in the limousine. They were two women caught in a transition that had no name, staring at the divide between who they were and who the world demanded they be. Marilyn felt a surge of protectiveness so strong it hurt. She realized that they were both victims of a society that only allowed women to be one thing or the other, a servant or a saint. The confrontation was not about the clothes, but about the termination of their old selves. Both women had seen too much to ever look in a mirror and see only one face again. They stood there, the rain washing away the powder and the pretense, two souls who had crossed a bridge that only they could see. Marilyn reached into her purse, her fingers brushing against the cold leather, knowing that the real exchange of the night was about to happen. A moment of humanity that would define the rest of Norma's life and solve the puzzle of how one face could belong to two completely different fates. As the diner bell chimed inside, signaling a new rush of customers, Marilyn leaned in close to share one final quiet truth that had nothing to do with Hollywood and everything to do with home. The back alley door groaned on its hinges as the two women stood pressed against the damp brick wall, the glamorous star and the weary waitress finally shedding the roles they had just played. The air between them was no longer filled with the thrill of a secret game, but with the heavy, pulsing truth of two lifetimes that had been fractured by the same cold winds of fate. Marilyn reached out, her fingers gently tracing the edge of the scar on Norma's thumb, the same mark that marred her own soft skin. It wasn't just a resemblance of bone and hair, it was an intersection of history that went back to the days before either of them knew the sting of fame or the exhaustion of labor. They stood in the shadows of Los Angeles, two orphans of a world that had forgotten them long before the camera started rolling. Norma leaned her head against the brick, her eyes brimming with a liquid grief that had been stored up for 40 years. She spoke of the foster homes that felt like prisons, the rooms where she had slept on the floor, and the mothers who had passed away like shadows into the night. As she spoke, Marilyn felt the ghost of Norma Jeane rise up within her, answering every sob with a memory of her own, the loneliness of a girl who had to invent a goddess just to survive the day. The narrative shift from impersonation to sisterhood was a seismic break in the foundation of their identities. They were no longer a star and an admirer. They were two survivors recognizing the same old wounds in the dim light of a service entrance. Marilyn realized that the world saw the blonde curls and the red lips, but only this woman in the coffee-stained apron knew the weight of the girl who had been thrown away by everyone who was supposed to love her. They held onto each other's hands, a circuit of shared pain finally closing, creating a sanctuary in the alleyway that no director could ever block out. It was a catharsis that went beyond the screen, a moment where the fake double and the real icon realized that their suffering made them the only two authentic people in the city. The shared trauma was the invisible thread that had pulled them to this diner in the middle of the night, a cosmic correction for the paths that had diverged so cruelly years ago. Every secret Marilyn had ever buried about her childhood, every quiet scream she had muffled into a silk pillow, found an echo in Norma's weary story. They were looking into a mirror that didn't show beauty, but showed the strength required to endure being unloved for so long. The intimacy was absolute, a spiritual twinship born from the realization that they were the same. Soul, split by the lottery of Hollywood and the unfair hand of chance. As the rain slowed to a soft rhythmic dripping off the rusty gutters, the two women stood in a state of grace, anchored by the knowledge that they were finally, truly seen by someone who held the exact same scars. Marilyn looked at Norma, seeing not a stranger, but a part of herself that had finally come home to ask for forgiveness. She knew she couldn't walk away now, leaving this version of herself to continue the battle alone in the fluorescent glow of the diner. The heavy silence was broken by the distant siren of a police car, a reminder that the world outside their alleyway was still moving, still demanding they be the people they were no longer. Marilyn reached deep into her pocket, pulling out a small, velvet-bound notebook that held the key to a future Norma Jeanette never thought she deserved. a future that would remain history's most beautiful missing piece. Marilyn looked at the woman standing before her, a woman who carried the same face but a heart that was far more tired, and she knew she could not leave her to vanish back into the steam of the kitchen. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small, thick envelope, pressing it into Norma's rough, chapped palms as the rain turned into a soft, shimmering mist. Inside were not just several $1,000s in cash, a fortune that would take decades to earn in a diner, but a small, leather-bound book containing personal phone numbers and names of people who could help a woman start over. But the envelope was not the true gift. The gift was the way Marilyn held Norma's face between her soft, famous hands, looking past the exhaustion and the faded uniform to see the soul beneath. She told her that this night was a conclusion of the identity she had used as a shield, a permission to stop being a copy and start being a human being. Marilyn's voice was a soft, steady anchor in the darkness as she promised Norma that she would never have to pour another cup of coffee for a man who didn't see her humanity. She gave her a name, not Norma Jeane, and certainly not Marilyn, but a new name they decided upon in the quiet of that back alley, a name that belonged to no one but the woman she was about to become. The moment was a transfer of energy, a cathartic release where the goddess reached back in time to save the girl she used to be. As Norma clutched the envelope to her chest, the years of invisibility seemed to flake away like old paint, replaced by a terrifying, beautiful hope. They were no longer two women sharing a trauma. They were two architects designing a private future where the mirror would never again be an enemy. Marilyn realized that by saving this woman, she was finally allowing a part of herself to have a happy ending, a quiet house by the sea, away from the clicking of shutters and the heat of the flashbulbs. She was erasing the tragedy of the duplicate and creating a sister instead. The air felt lighter, the scent of the rain now smelling of jasmine and rebirth as Norma realized that for the first time in 40 years, the weight of the world was no longer her burden to carry alone. Marilyn kissed her cheek, the soft brush of her lips leaving a mark that no camera could ever capture, a seal on a pact made in the shadows. She watched as the woman who had walked into the alley as a ghost stood up straight, her chin lifted with the quiet authority of someone who had just been handed their life back. They stood together one last time, looking at the diner that had been a cage, knowing that when the sun rose, only one of them would be returning to the pedestal, while the other walked toward the horizon. Marilyn signaled to her driver, her face set with a newfound peace that had been absent for years. She walked toward the limousine, the silk of her scarf catching the dim light of the street lamp, but she didn't look back until she was sure the woman in the alley was moving toward the future. The engine hummed to life, a low purr that signaled the return to reality, but the silence inside the car was filled with the echoes of a woman who had just been reborn. Marilyn looked at her own reflection in the tinted glass, and for the first time in a decade, the person looking back was not an icon, but a friend. Years later, on a quiet, salt-sprayed afternoon in a coastal village far from the neon reach of Los Angeles, a local woman stood by a modest white fence, her face turned toward the setting sun. She lived a life of quiet rhythm, baking bread for neighbors, tending to a small garden of lavender, and watching the tide pull the day into the sea. Yet her blue eyes held a depth of peace that belonged to someone who had been given a second chance at the light. This was the legacy of the double, the diner ghost who became the heart of a quiet village. While the world mourned a legend in 1962, this woman lived on, proving the icon's official end was not the only story. Every morning, she saw Marilyn's face in the mirror, but the sting of invisibility was gone, replaced by a deep gratitude for that rainy night. Marilyn hadn't just given her money, she had given her a name and the freedom to exist away from the world's gaze. In her final months, Marilyn drew strength from imagining this quiet life. She knew that even if her own lights faded, a part of her soul was happy under a different sun. By ending her twins' loneliness, Marilyn found a sanctuary for her own spirit. To her neighbors, the woman was just a kind friend who hummed torch songs, a living embodiment of the star's dream, to be real, to be loved for her heart, and to finally be at peace. The letters between them had been few and unsigned, whispers of sisterhood sent across the miles to confirm that the flame was still burning. On the day the news broke that the star had passed away, the coastal woman let a single silk headscarf catch the wind, watching it dance over the waves before sinking into the deep. She didn't weep for the legend. She wept for the friend who had traded her own shield to give a stranger a sword. She realized that she was now the keeper of the look, the final reflection of a beauty that had been a burden to one and a blessing to the other. She lived with the weight of that responsibility, carrying the grace of the goddess into every mundane, beautiful act of her ordinary days. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving a trail of gold on the water that reminded her of a velvet dress in a flickering spotlight. She turned back toward her warm cottage, her silhouette moving with a quiet confidence that was entirely her own. Somewhere in the silence of that house, tucked inside a wooden chest, sat a crumpled photograph of a mother and a small crescent scar on a thumb. The only evidence left of the night the identity crisis became a miracle, a secret so pure it challenges everything history claims to know about 1962. In the velvet quiet of a summer evening, the final truth remains written in the starlight above a small coastal cottage, that the greatest performance Marilyn Monroe ever gave was the one she staged for no audience at all. It was the night she stopped playing a role and started saving a life, proving that the woman in the mirror is never as important as the soul waiting for a chance to be real. As the years drifted like leaves, the fake double became the secret triumph of Marilyn's heart. While we worship the icon, we forget that beneath the makeup was a woman who simply wanted to be seen. That night, Marilyn saw the end of her own isolation in the eyes of a waitress. By giving her a double a future, she planted a seed of herself in a world where fame could never reach. The look-alike lived on for decades, a walking echo of a beauty that never grew old, finding the peace that Marilyn was denied. She saw the grandchildren Marilyn never held and touched the salt air without fear, loved for her name rather than her fame. This teaches us that life is measured by the hearts we heal, not the faces who know us. Marilyn left behind films, but she also left a living woman who carried their shared scars to the end. In a trade of epic proportions, the star accepted the burden of being a goddess so the waitress could have the dignity of being a person. Now, whenever the tide pulls, the ghosts of two sisters remain. The mystery of that night is that the waitress was never the double. Marilyn was the one doubling for Norma Jeane, and through a stranger, she finally let the real girl go home. The last reflection wasn't found in a glass mirror, but in a silk scarf drifting into the sea, signaling that the burden of beauty was finally gone. So, the next time you look at a photograph of the world's most famous blonde, look closely at the eyes. There is a twinkle there that isn't from the studio lamps. It's the secret knowledge that somewhere on a porch by the sea, a version of her is still breathing the fresh air, happy and free, living the dream that the icon passed away to protect. If this story of Marilyn's greatest secret touched you, hit that subscribe button to join our family and witness the real people history tries to forget. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the most important people are often the ones the world doesn't see. And drop a comment below. If you could trade places for a day to help another person, whose life would you want to step into?